Friends, welcome. I want to talk to you today about science in the person of Giordano Bruno, of whom many of you may not have heard. Bruno was a multiply gifted scientist who did not use mathematics directly, but who anticipated in amazing ways things that were going to happen in our time and slightly before. At the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, a great mathematician named Georg Cantor conceived of something that struck his world as impossible. And that was the idea that there's more than one infinity. You might be moved to say, how could there be more than one infinity? Infinity is everything. But he conceived of there being different sizes of infinities. My goodness gracious. In his time, he was rejected violently almost. He ended up committing suicide for that astonishing realization, which you and I are going to realize was anticipated by Giordano Bruno in the late 1500s. Bruno started out as a Dominican monk. The Dominicans were the great intellectuals. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican monk. And then he read Copernicus's proof that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, but that in fact the Earth circled around the sun, and that all of the moving stars, the planets, circled around the sun. Now, in his time, to say that was to infuriate the church. Actually, in the 15 teens, he had realized that, and he told his students that. But he was fearful of inflaming the church against him and said nothing until he was dying. And then, in the early 1560s, he wrote a work demonstrating that, in fact, the sun was the center of this solar system, not the Earth. He demonstrated that mathematically, tremendous mathematics, and took account even of a thing called retrograde motion. If you look at the movement of the planets around the sun, at a certain point, they seem to move backwards, retrograde motion. And Copernicus actually figured out that the retrograde motion is a result of seeing other things moving in such a manner as to make it appear that the things were moving backward, but they weren't actually. That kind of intense mathematical proof. This is a long time before Isaac Newton, who's I very often credited with bringing mathematics to bear on scientific insights. Copernicus did it in the 1500s. So Newton was doing it in the late 1600s. Bruno, this Dominican monk, read Copernicus and said, "My goodness gracious, Copernicus is right." Now, Copernicus, in an attempt to placate the church, said all the stars form an outer circle around the solar system that I've just given you. They form an outer circle, and God is outside of that circle in the heavens. Bruno read that. He said, Copernicus is wonderful, but he's absolutely wrong about the locations of the stars. If we look up, we can see that there are some stars that are closer to us, some are further away. And Bruno said, not only that, but I think the universe is infinite in size. Now, Einstein, when he did his general relativity, was told that his general relativity suggests that the universe is either expanding or contracting, and he couldn't stand that. He thought the universe was fixed, and he actually developed numbers that enabled him to cancel out that expansion or contraction. Then, several years later, Hubble proved with telescopes that the universe was in fact expanding and was infinite. And Einstein said, my God, he was correct. If I had the faith in my own work that I should have had, I could have predicted that. But let's let that rest. Bruno, in the 1580s, thinks that the universe is infinite. He writes a wonderful book called On the Finite, the Universe, and the World. He doesn't do his work mathematically, though Copernicus did his mathematically. But he says, you know what? The universe is infinite, therefore it has an infinity of stars in it. And therefore, there are more stars in the smaller infinity than the infinite universe, which is just one thing. Moreover, many of those stars will have planets going around them like ours. And there are going to be more infinite planets around those infinite stars than there are stars. There are a multiplicity of infinities. My goodness gracious. Well, the church, for those ideas, and Bruno had to escape Italy. He was well at universities all around Europe, including England, where he tried to get next to Queen Elizabeth, but she wasn't interested. Let that rest. The amazing thing was that Giordano Bruno had anticipated major transformations in understanding mathematics without using mathematics to do so. Now, many of my scientific friends want to say, oh, he was just lucky. Don't pay attention to him. But I think we have to accept him as the giant that he is and was. He anticipated modern cosmology, modern physics, cosmological physics. He anticipated quantum, a series of astonishingly great things that I hope you will enjoy pursuing. Ultimately, he got a letter from a friend of his, a person he thought was his friend, who said, "Come back to Venice. Nobody's interested in what you're doing anymore. You can just live here and work in my mansion." And Bruno thought, well, that's a good idea. He went back and his friend reported him to the church. The church in Venice called him in, investigated what he was doing, thought it was so silly that no one would believe it, sent him back and sent a note to Rome saying, forget it, he's not a problem at all. He just has these weird ideas. But Rome sent for him, tortured him to try to get him to relinquish his ideas. And when he refused, saying he was loyal to his infinite spiritual infinity that created the physical infinity of the universe and could not betray that loyalty, they burned him to death. And if you go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, you're going to see that they'll mention Bruno. And they'll say, no, he wasn't burned to death for his ideas about the universe. He said some nasty things about the Virgin Mary. We don't have to go down that street. They burned Giordano Bruno. In my eyes, one of the great geniuses in history. Thanks so much for being with me for this short introduction.